the air thickens with the smell of burned sandalwood and pulverized history. The year is 1860. This is not a battlefield. It is an imperial garden, the jewel of Chinese civilization. The old summer palace, Yuan Ming Yuan. British and French soldiers, not as a conquering army but as a mob of vandals, descend upon treasures accumulated over millennia. They rip the inlays from mirrors, carry off silks worth more than gold, and when they can take no more, they set fire to everything. The flames devour unparalleled works of art, libraries of ancient texts, the very soul of an empire. Today, hundreds of those stolen treasures adorn museums in London and Paris. This is not just a page in a history book. It is an open wound, a cultural crime that has never been redressed. To understand China's distrust of the West, don't look at today's headlines. Look at the ashes of Yuan Ming Yuan. That is the origin of the pain. On the Ancient Truths channel, we unearth the ghosts of the past to explain the realities of the present, and the ghost that haunts the relationship between China and the West is that of a fundamental betrayal. To understand it, we must go back. To an era when China was not a nation seeking its place, but the center of the world itself. For centuries, before the name of the West had even whispered on its shores, China was the Middle Kingdom, from the Han Dynasty, which flourished from 206 BC to 220 AD, to the glorious Tang Dynasty in the 8th century AD. It was a civilization solitary in its greatness. While Europe struggled through the darkness of the Middle Ages, China had already mapped the heavens, invented printing, and perfected the art of governing millions. Its steel production surpassed that of Great Britain. Until the 18th century AD, they did not see foreigners as equals, but as barbarians on the periphery, fortunate enough to offer tribute to the Son of Heaven. In the 15th century AD, Admiral Zheng He commanded a fleet of over 200 ships, far larger than any navy Europe could dream of, sailing as far as Africa. But China, in its infinite self-sufficiency, turned its back on the world. What could the outside world offer that it didn't already have? This arrogance, born from a millennium of undisputed superiority, would be its Achilles heel. While the Chinese dragon slumbered in its isolated glory, the West was being forged in the fire and steam of the Industrial Revolution. Its ships were now made of iron, its cannons reached unimaginable distances, and its thirst for markets and resources was insatiable. The clash was not a possibility, it was a historical inevitability. The problem was tea. The West, especially Great Britain, was obsessed with it, but China only accepted silver in return. Europe's silver was bleeding into the emperor's coffers.
We will destroy you, China.
The British solution was not to create a better product. It was to create an addiction. They began to cultivate opium in India and flood China with it. It was not just a product, it was a chemical weapon designed to destabilize a nation from within. By 1839, millions of Chinese were addicted. The economy was staggering. and the social fabric was tearing.
Burn everything in opium now.
When the Emperor finally acted and destroyed thousands of chests of opium, the West responded not with diplomacy, but with cannons. The First Opium War was a massacre, not a war. China's wooden junks were shattered by British steam-powered warships. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, the first of the unequal treaties. It was not an agreement between nations. It was a surrender at gunpoint. Hong Kong was torn away. Ports were forced to open, and for the first time in its history, foreign citizens were above Chinese law on Chinese soil. Sovereignty was not just wounded, it was violated. What followed was a century of horror. What the Chinese remember as the century of humiliation. A second Opium War, this time with France also looting, culminated with the burning of the Summer Palace. Western powers, along with a newly modernized and hungry Japan, carved up China like a melon at a feast. Poppies, spheres of influence, concessions. Beijing was occupied by armies of 8 different nations to suppress the Boxer Rebellion.
We love China. China is ours.
A last desperate cry of a humiliated people. They were forced to pay a brutal indemnity that would take decades to pay off. This experience didn't create distrust. It branded it onto the national soul. The lesson was clear and terrible. The West does not respect strength. It only fears it. It doesn't seek mutual trade. It seeks submission. It doesn't bring civilization. It brings destruction. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912 AD, China descended into chaos. Warlords carved up the country, and the Western powers continued to play with its destiny, supporting one faction or another according to their convenience. It was in this cauldron of desperation and nationalism that a new force was born: the Chinese Communist Party. Their message was simple and powerful: the end of humiliation. They promised to unite China, expel the foreigners, and restore lost dignity. When they won the Civil War in 1949, it was not just a change of government. It was the birth of a new national mission: never again. This mission was immediately tested in the Korean War, when UN forces, led by the United States, reached the Yalu River border. China saw the same monster of the 19th century knocking at its door. It intervened with hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and in bloody battles against the world superpower, they halted their advance. For China, it was not a war for Korea. It was a war for its own survival, a test that they would never again be pushed around. They faced the West and survived. That victory, at a terrible cost,
Victory is ours!
became the cornerstone of its new identity. During the Cold War, even its alliance with the Soviet Union broke, demonstrating a fundamental distrust of any foreign power. China's path would be a solitary one, based on ironclad self-sufficiency. Nixon's visit in 1972 was not an embrace of reconciliation. It was a pragmatic calculation. Both sides needed a counterweight against the USSR, but the wound was still there, covered by a veneer of diplomacy. When Deng Xiaoping opened China to Western investment in 1978, he did not do it out of a love for capitalism. He did it as a strategy, a way to drink from the well of Western technology and wealth to strengthen China for the long term. They used the tools of the West to build a fortress against the West. And the distrust never disappeared. Every modern incident is viewed through the prism of the 19th century. The NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999 was not a map error. It was a deliberate reminder of who holds the power. The collision of a US spy plane with a Chinese fighter in 2001 was not an accident. It was a violation of their airspace. China's distrust of the West is not a policy. It is an identity. It is the ghost of Yuan Ming Yuan that still stands in the middle of any negotiation. It is the memory of millions of opium addicts that whispers in every discussion about trade. It is the echo of British cannons that resonates in every patrol in the South China Sea. To the West, China often seems like a threat, an aggressive rival that doesn't play by the rules. But from the Chinese perspective, they are simply following the only lesson history has taught them. The only way to ensure that the century of humiliation is never repeated is to become so strong that no one ever again dares to try. Can this fracture ever be healed? History suggests it is almost impossible. It would require the West to acknowledge not only its mistakes, but the depth of the trauma it caused. And it would require China to look beyond its narrative of victimization and resurgence. But both sides are trapped in their own histories, stories that are too important to their own political and psychological survival to abandon. As you look to the future, remember the ashes of the Summer Palace. Remember the treasures that still hang in distant museums. That is not an ancient story. It is the reality of today. Distrust is not an obstacle on the path. It is the path itself. On Ancient Truths, our purpose is to illuminate these hidden truths that define our world. If this deep dive into the wound that divides East and West has made you see the world differently, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue unearthing the past to understand the future. Because the line that separates China and the West was not drawn on a map. It was etched with fire, with steel, and with the tears of a humiliated empire. And as long as that line remains in the collective memory, the abyss of distrust can only grow wider. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time and pain. On Ancient Truths, we know that to build a different future, we must first confront the ancient truths.